The ice in the tumbler didn't just clink. It froze midair as the heavy oak doors of the neon throne swung open. Marcus Salazar, the man who had spent 20 years turning his nephew's legacy into a playground for the corrupt, was mid-laugh, basking in the purple glow of his stolen empire. He was the king of the city, until the shadows at the entrance coalesced into a ghost. A single silhouette stood framed by the blinding white light of the Chicago street. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a charcoal trench coat and a brimmed hat that cast his face into a terrifying, familiar darkness. In the underworld of Chicago, silence is usually a sign that someone is about to die. But for Marcus Salazar, silence was something he thought he had bought and paid for 20 years ago. As he stood in the VIP lounge of his multi-million-dollar club, Marcus was a man at the height of his hubris. He held a glass of 20-year-old scotch, the same age as the secret he kept buried in a prison cell. But then, the music didn't just stop, it seemed to die. Marcus turned, his short gray hair catching the neon light, a smug smile still plastered on his face. Then he saw him. The man in the doorway didn't scream. He didn't pull a gun. He simply stood there, a mountain of shadow against the city lights. The glass in Marcus's hand tilted. The expensive scotch splashed against the glossy floor, unheeded. Marcus's eyes widened, his mouth agape as if he'd seen a corpse rise from the grave. Dominic Salazar was home, and the quiet storm was about to wash away everything Marcus had built. The heavy iron gates of Stateville Penitentiary didn't just open, they groaned, a rusted, metallic shriek that sounded like the dying breath of a beast. For Dominic Salazar, that sound had been the punctuation mark at the end of every day for 7,305 days. But today, the sound was different. Today, it was an invitation. He stepped across the threshold, the soles of his prison-issued boots hitting the gravel with a crunch that felt deafening in the early morning stillness. Dominic stopped, his tall, broad frame casting a long, jagged shadow toward the perimeter fence. He didn't look back at the gray concrete monolith that had stolen his youth. Instead, he tilted his head back, closing his eyes as he took his first breath of cold, unfiltered Chicago air. It tasted of damp pavement, exhaust, and the coming winter, bitter and sharp, but to him, it was sweeter than the finest wine Marcus was currently sipping in his penthouse. 20 years. When he went in, his father's ring was still warm on his finger, and the Salazar name meant something more than greed. It meant loyalty. He had entered those gates a prince of the streets, 25 years old with the quiet storm just beginning to brew in his eyes. He was coming out a ghost, 45 years old, with skin as pale as parchment and a heart that had been forged into a blade of ice. He looked down at his hands. They were calloused from the machine shop and scarred from the lessons he'd had to teach in the yard, but they were steady. In 20 years, he hadn't allowed his mind to wander or his resolve to soften. While other inmates counted down the days to see their families or find a woman, Dominic had spent every waking second deconstructing the night of his arrest. He had replayed the way his uncle Marcus had stayed behind in the shadows when the siren screamed. He remembered the brief, predatory glint in Marcus's eyes as the handcuffs clicked shut on Dominic's wrists. A black sedan sat idling 100 yards down the road, its headlights cutting through the morning mist like the eyes of a wolf. Dominic knew it wasn't a friend waiting for him. He had no friends left. Marcus had seen to that, either by buying them or burying them. This was likely a scout, a set of eyes sent to see if the storm was still a threat or just a broken old man. Dominic adjusted the collar of the thin jacket they had given him upon release. He didn't shiver. The cold didn't bother a man who had been dead for 2 decades. He began to walk, his stride deliberate and rhythmic, each step reclaiming a piece of the city that belonged to him by blood. Marcus thought he had inherited an empire, but he had really only been a caretaker for a king in exile. As Dominic reached the road, he didn't head for the car. He headed for the bus stop. He would arrive in the city without fanfare, without a motorcade, and without a sound. The quiet storm wasn't coming back to start a war. He was coming back to finish one. 20 miles away, the air didn't taste of damp gravel and freedom. It tasted of expensive cigars and desperation. Inside the VIP lounge of the Neon Throne, Marcus Salazar sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of black obsidian, looking every bit the king he had murdered his conscience to become. At 70, he was a masterpiece of expensive tailoring and surgical refinement, but the neon purple light of the club had a way of bleeding through the cracks in his facade. The empire Marcus had built over the last 2 decades was a shimmering monument to excess. Under Dominic's father, the Salazar organization had been a ghost, quiet, efficient, and rooted in the ironclad loyalty of the South Side. Marcus had traded that substance for shadows and screens. He had expanded into digital fraud, high-end narcotics, and flashy real estate, turning the family business into a brand that screamed for attention. But beneath the gold-leafed ceilings and the glossy floors that reflected the city's skyline, the foundations were rotting. Marcus checked his gold watch, the movement of his hand slight but agitated. He was surrounded by associates who looked more like models than soldiers. Men in slim-fit suits who knew more about cryptocurrency than they did about holding a line in a street fight. This was the first of his mounting debts, a lack of true muscle. By purging the old guard who were loyal to Dominic, Marcus had left himself with a private army that would vanish the moment the payroll dried up. And the payroll was drying up. Marcus leaned back, staring at the digital ledger on his monitor. To fund his lifestyle and maintain his grip on the city's politicians, he had borrowed heavily from the Russian syndicates and the West Side cartels. He was a man playing a high-stakes game of musical chairs, moving money from one pocket to another to hide the fact that he was hemorrhaging capital. Every flashy gala he hosted, every new club he opened, was a frantic attempt to project a strength he no longer possessed. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. A young man with a headset whispered that the evening's intake was down 15%. Marcus waved him away with a snarl, but his heart hammered against his ribs. He felt the eyes of the city on him, not the eyes of the law, but the eyes of the predators he had invited to his table. They smelled the blood in the water. They knew the usurper was overextended. He reached for his glass of scotch, his fingers trembling just enough to make the ice clink. He told himself he was safe. He told himself the man who truly owned this chair was a forgotten number in a state database. But as the bass from the dance floor thudded through the walls like a slow, rhythmic heartbeat, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was merely a tenant in a house that was about to be reclaimed. He had spent 20 years feasting on a stolen legacy, but the bill was finally coming due. And the currency wouldn't be gold. It would be blood. The South Side of Chicago didn't care about the neon transformation of the downtown skyline. Here, the brick was still soot-stained, and the air still carried the heavy, metallic scent of the old stockyards. Dominic moved through the narrow alleys like a shadow returning to its original shape. He didn't need a map. His muscles remembered every turn, every cracked pavement stone, and every blind corner. He was heading for a small, nondescript garage tucked behind a row of crumbling brownstones, a place that smelled of motor oil and old loyalties. Inside, the light was dim, provided by a single flickering bulb that hummed in a low, morning tone. Beneath the chassis of a rusted '67 Mustang, a pair of grease-stained legs protruded. This was Elias, the Axel Vance. 20 years ago, he had been the most trusted driver in the Salazar fleet, the man who had driven Dominic's father to every sit-down and every celebration. When the gates closed on Dominic, Marcus had offered Elias a fortune to stay. Elias had responded by spitting on Marcus's Italian leather loafers and walking away from the life forever. Dominic stood at the edge of the grease pit, his presence silent and heavy. He didn't speak. He simply waited. The sliding of the mechanic's creeper was the only sound in the room. As Elias rolled out from under the car, he wiped his hands on a rag that was blacker than the oil he was cleaning. He looked up, squinting against the dim light, and then he froze. The rag slipped from his fingers. For a long moment, the two men simply stared at one another. Elias was thinner now, his hair a shock of white, his face a roadmap of 2 decades of hard, honest labor. But his eyes, sharp and observant, hadn't changed. "I heard the wind was picking up," Elias whispered, his voice like gravel grinding together. They said the storm was dead, Dominic. They said you'd never see the sun again. The sun is overrated, Elias, Dominic replied, his voice a low, rhythmic rumble. I've grown fond of the dark. Elias stood up slowly, his joints popping. He walked over to a heavy steel workbench, his limp a reminder of a chase that had gone wrong in the late 90s. He reached behind a stack of old tires and pulled out a dented metal toolbox. It wasn't filled with wrenches. From a false bottom, he extracted a weathered leather ledger and a tarnished brass key. Your father knew Marcus was a snake, Elias said, his eyes misting over. He couldn't prove it before he passed, but he made sure the truth was parked somewhere Marcus couldn't find it. He told me that if the day ever came when the true heir walked through that door, I was to give him the keys to the kingdom. Dominic took the key. It felt heavy, a physical piece of his stolen past. Where is it, Elias? The old rail yard, the driver replied. Locker 402. It's been waiting 20 years for the right hand to turn the lock. Dominic nodded, a silent vow passing between them. He didn't offer money, and Elias didn't ask for it. This was a debt of honor, the kind Marcus would never understand. As Dominic turned to leave, Elias called out into the shadows. Be careful, son. The city is loud now. They've forgotten how to listen for the ring. Dominic didn't look back. Let them forget, he said. The loudest thunder always follows the deepest silence. The Chicago rail yards were a skeletal maze of rusted steel and frozen gravel, a place where the city's industrial heartbeat had slowed to a rhythmic, lonely thrum. In the dead of night, the only movement was the white plumes of steam rising from the vents of a black sedan parked near the perimeter of Gate 12. This was Marcus's Golden Gate, the primary artery through which his untraceable shipments flowed, digital components, high-end narcotics, and the heavy crates of untaxed luxury goods that kept his creditors at bay. Dominic stood on the overhead gantry, his long trench coat snapping in the biting wind. He didn't look like a man about to commit a heist. He looked like an architect reviewing a blueprint. In his hand, he held the small brass key Elias had given him, but he didn't need it yet. Tonight wasn't about reclaiming property. It was about the art of the void. Marcus's security was modern, expensive, and arrogant. They relied on infrared sweeps, motion sensors, and a centralized digital hub that monitored every bolt on every shipping container. But Marcus had forgotten that the men who built the foundations of this yard weren't programmers. They were union men who shared blood and whiskey with Dominic's father. Dominic didn't draw a weapon. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, vintage radio transmitter, a device that looked like a relic from a Cold War spy kit. He tuned the dial to a specific frequency, one that had been reserved for emergencies only since the late 90s. He spoke 3 words into the receiver. The storm breaks. A mile away, in the central switching station, an old man with silver hair and a Salazar tattoo hidden under his sleeve pulled a manual lever that hadn't been touched in a decade. The effect was instantaneous. The digital grid didn't just flicker. It collapsed into a feedback loop. The automated cranes groaned to a halt mid-swing, dangling multi-million-dollar containers like giant, helpless puppets. The electronic gates locked in a closed position, and the silent alarm system began to broadcast a loop of white noise that jammed every security radio on the frequency. Dominic watched from above as Marcus's elite guards scrambled like ants in a glass jar. They looked at their tablets and their high-tech headsets, but the screens were dead. They were trapped in a world of silence they weren't trained to handle. Below, a massive freighter train, carrying the bulk of Marcus's quarterly revenue, hissed to a stop 3 miles short of the depot. For an hour, the main port of entry for the Salazar Empire ceased to exist. Dominic didn't stick around to watch the chaos. He didn't steal a single crate. He didn't need to. By the time the sun rose, every one of Marcus's creditors would know that the Golden Gate was no longer secure. The rumor would spread faster than a fire. The quiet storm had returned, and he didn't even need to pull a trigger to bring the city to its knees. As Dominic walked back toward the shadows of the south side, the only sound was the soft crunch of his boots on the frost. Marcus had built a world of noise, but he was about to learn that in the dark, the loudest sound is the one hand clapping, the sound of everything you own vanishing into thin air. The Salazar estate was a sprawling fortress of limestone and arrogance, perched on a hill that overlooked the city like a gargoyle. Tonight, the dining room was bathed in the warm, artificial glow of a crystal chandelier that cost more than the prison block Dominic had called home for 2 decades. At the head of the long, mahogany table sat Marcus, flanked by his New World lieutenants and their polished wives. They were celebrating the anniversary of Marcus's ascension, clinking crystal flutes of vintage champagne, while a private chef carved prime rib in the corner. The security at the front gate had been bypassed without a sound, not with force, but with the simple presentation of a blood-red signet ring that the older guards still feared more than death. The heavy double doors of the dining hall didn't burst open. They glided apart on silent hinges. The laughter at the table died a sudden, jagged death. Marcus, mid-sentence about a new offshore development, froze. His silver fork clattered against his china plate, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the vacuum of the room. Dominic walked in, his charcoal trench coat still damp from the Chicago drizzle. He didn't look like a trespasser. He looked like the master of the house returning from a long walk. He moved with a predatory grace that made the young, gym-toned bodyguards reach for their holsters, only to stop when they saw the terrifying stillness in Dominic's eyes. The help said there was a seat at the head of the table, Dominic said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to rattle the glassware. I see you've been keeping it warm for me, Uncle. Marcus's face went through a rapid transformation, from ghostly shock to a forced, trembling mask of paternal joy. He was a man who lived by the performance, and even with his heart hammering against his ribs, he knew he couldn't let his soldiers see him break. Dominic, Marcus cried out, his voice thin and brittle. He stood up, spreading his arms wide as if to embrace a ghost. My boy, my dear brave boy, we heard the news of your release, but we didn't expect. Well, sit. Please. A plate for my nephew. The tension in the room was a living thing, a coiled snake ready to strike. Dominic pulled out a chair directly opposite Marcus, the legs screeching against the marble floor. He didn't sit. He leaned over the table, his presence looming over the expensive feast. I'm not hungry for your food, Marcus, Dominic whispered, loud enough for every man at the table to hear. I spent 20 years eating iron and bitterness. I've developed a very specific taste. He reached out and picked up Marcus's steak knife. It was a beautiful tool, balanced and sharp. Dominic turned it over in his hand, the light of the chandelier dancing off the blade. Marcus didn't move. He couldn't. He saw the quiet storm staring back at him. And for the first time in 20 years, he realized that a cage doesn't just hold a beast, it hones it. We have so much to discuss, Marcus stammered, his eyes darting to the knife. The business, the family, everything I've built for you. Dominic set the knife down, the point buried an inch deep into the expensive mahogany table. You didn't build this for me, Uncle. You built it for your funeral. I'm just here to make sure the guest list is in order. Dominic turned and walked out, leaving the loving family dinner in a silence so thick it felt like suffocation. He hadn't drawn a drop of blood, yet Marcus sat back down, feeling as though he were already bleeding out. Marcus sat in a darkened room that looked more like a NASA command center than a Mafia office. High-definition monitors lined the walls, casting a cold blue glow over his frantic features. He had spent millions on this: facial recognition software, a private satellite hookup, and a team of 20-something hackers who could find a needle in a digital haystack. I want him found, Marcus hissed, his voice cracking. He's a man from the 90s. He doesn't know how to hide from a world that sees everything. The lead technician, a boy with a pale face and shaking fingers, tapped frantically at his mechanical keyboard. They had spiked every CCTV camera from the south side to the Gold Coast. They had used AI to analyze the gait and height of every man wearing a trench coat in the city of Chicago. They had even pinged the few burner phones that had been activated near the Salazar estate. We have a hit at the transit hub, the technician announced. A grainy image of a tall man in a hat appeared on the main screen. Marcus leaned in, his eyes hungry for a target. Zoom in. Enhance. The image sharpened, but as it did, the man in the video turned toward the camera. He didn't run. He simply raised a hand, and the screen erupted into a blizzard of digital snow. One by one, the monitors began to flicker and die. The blue light turned to a deep, ominous red as a system-wide breach alert began to wail. Dominic wasn't running from the cameras. He was using them as a trail of breadcrumbs to lead Marcus into a trap of his own making. While Marcus was busy staring at screens, Dominic was moving through the dead zones of the city, the old subway tunnels, the forgotten basements of the industrial district, and the neighborhoods where the streetlights had been shot out years ago and never replaced. He knew that in a world of total surveillance, the only way to be invisible was to be a ghost in the machine. Suddenly, every screen in the room cleared, replaced by a single, high-resolution feed. It wasn't a street corner. It was a live shot of Marcus's own server room, located 3 floors below them. In the center of the frame, a single analog clock sat on a server rack. The second hand ticked forward with agonizing precision. Beside it lay a small, handwritten note that simply read, "The lights are going out, Uncle." The technician's hands flew over the keys. "I can't lock him out. He's not using a remote hack. He's physically patched into the hard line." Marcus felt a cold sweat break out across his brow. He had built his empire on the belief that data was power, but he had forgotten that data is fragile. Dominic was a quiet storm precisely because he didn't leave a digital footprint. He used the tools of the modern world to highlight his own absence. He was a shadow that couldn't be captured, a ghost that refused to be seen until it was too late. As the servers began to hiss and the smell of ozone filled the room, Marcus realized that all his technology had done was give his nephew a front-row seat to his downfall. He wasn't tracking Dominic. Dominic was haunting him. The meeting was held in the basement of an old social club in Little Italy, a place where the air was thick with the smell of espresso, stale tobacco, and the unwritten laws of the old world. Around the scarred oak table sat the heads of the 5 families, the true architects of the city's shadow economy. They were men of stone and iron, and for 20 years, they had tolerated Marcus Salazar because he kept the profits high and the police at bay. But loyalty in this room was a commodity, and the price of Marcus's stock was about to plummet. Dominic stood at the foot of the table, a stark contrast to the colorful, silk-clad elders. He looked like a man who had walked out of a black-and-white photograph, his presence heavy with the gravity of his father's era. He didn't ask for permission to speak. He simply placed a thick, leather-bound folder in the center of the table. "Marcus has told you for years that the Salazar family is a fortress," Dominic said, his voice a low, steady thrum that commanded the room. "But a fortress built on debt is just a prison with a better view. While you were honoring the treaties, my uncle was selling the floorboards out from under you." One by one, the bosses leaned in. Inside the folder were the documents Elias had kept hidden, the keys to the kingdom. They weren't just bank statements. They were a roadmap of Marcus's betrayals. There were digital receipts showing that Marcus had been skimming off the top of the joint construction unions for a decade. There were encrypted logs of his private negotiations with the West Coast cartels, offering them a backdoor entrance into Chicago's distribution routes, a direct violation of the 5 families' charter. The room grew cold. The oldest among them, a man with skin like wrinkled parchment named Don Marcello, ran a finger over a signature on a ledger. It was Marcus's handwriting, authorizing the sale of a territory that belonged to Marcello's nephew. "He's playing us for fools," Marcello rasped, his eyes lifting to meet Dominic's. "He uses our names to shield his own greed, then sells our secrets to the highest bidder." Dominic nodded slowly. "Marcus isn't a leader. He's a parasite. He traded the Salazar honor for a glass house. And tonight, I'm giving you the stones to break it." In the world of the commission, there was no trial, only the removal of protection. By the time the folder was closed, the usurper was a man without a country. The bosses didn't need to say a word. The silent agreement was etched into their faces. Marcus's private security, his political connections, and his immunity were gone. He was no longer a king. He was just a target. Dominic walked out of the social club, the cool night air hitting his face. He had stripped Marcus of his armor without firing a single shot. The glass house was shattered, and the quiet storm was now the only thing standing between his uncle and the wolves he had spent 20 years inviting to his door. The hunt had officially begun. The basement of the old Salazar social club smelled exactly as it had 20 years ago, a suffocating mix of damp concrete, iron, and stale cigar smoke. It was here, amidst the stacks of dry goods crates and the hum of the industrial boiler, that the handcuffs had first bit into Dominic's wrists. Tonight, the room was dimly lit by a single, swinging bulb that threw long, erratic shadows against the walls, the same shadows that had hidden Marcus as he watched the police drag his nephew away. Marcus was already there, but he wasn't standing. He was collapsed into a wooden chair, his $1,000 suit jacket torn and his silver hair disheveled. He looked small. Without the neon lights of his clubs or the wall of bodyguards, he was just a frightened old man shivering in a cellar. He looked up as Dominic stepped into the light, and for the first time, there was no mask of loving uncle left to wear. "You think you've won," Marcus rasped, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "You think the families will let you rule? You're a ghost, Dominic. You're a relic from a dead world." Dominic didn't answer immediately. He walked to the exact spot where he had been shoved to the floor 2 decades ago. He looked down at the concrete, seeing the faint, faded stains of the past. "I didn't come back to rule, Marcus. I came back to balance the books." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, digital recorder. He pressed play. The voice that filled the basement wasn't Dominic's. It was the wheezing, panicked confession of the detective Marcus had bribed to plant the evidence 20 years ago. The man had died shortly after giving the statement to Elias, but his words remained, a verbal ghost that stripped away Marcus's last shred of denial. "I loved you like a son," Marcus whispered, a final, pathetic attempt at manipulation. Dominic's eyes remained 2 chips of frozen flint. "No. You loved the chair. You loved the power. You loved it so much you let your own blood rot in a 6x9 cell so you could play king in a house that wasn't yours." Dominic stepped closer, his shadow engulfing Marcus. He didn't pull a gun. He didn't need to. The quiet storm was no longer a threat. It was a settled fact. He placed a heavy hand on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture that looked almost affectionate from a distance, but the grip was like a vice. "The police are on their way, Uncle. This time, the evidence is real. And this time, there are no bribes left to pay. You spent 20 years in my house. Now, I've spent 20 years preparing yours." As the distant wail of sirens began to echo down the alleyway, Dominic turned toward the stairs. He didn't look back at the man who had stolen half his life. The basement truth had been spoken, and the air in the room finally felt clean. The quiet storm had passed, leaving behind nothing but the cold, hard clarity of justice. Dominic walked up toward the light, leaving Marcus in the dark, exactly where he belonged. The sun rose over Lake Michigan, casting a cold, gold light across the glass and steel of the Salazar headquarters. Inside the top-floor boardroom, the air no longer smelled of desperation or cheap perfume. It smelled of ozone and fresh ink. The flashy, neon-lit excess of Marcus's era had been stripped away, replaced by a quiet, understated elegance that mirrored the man now standing at the head of the table. Dominic stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over a city that felt fundamentally different than it had 48 hours ago. The frantic, jagged pulse of Marcus's rule had smoothed out into a deep, steady rhythm. The streets were quiet, not with the silence of a graveyard, but with the silence of a house that finally had a master who knew how to keep the doors locked. He turned back to the table. Around it sat the remaining loyalists, the ones who had stayed true to the old ways, and the new blood that had the sense to recognize a true king when they saw one. There were no champagne flutes today. There were only black coffees and the heavy, leather-bound folders that contained the new blueprints for the Salazar legacy. "My father used to say that power isn't about how much noise you make," Dominic said, his voice cutting through the room with the weight of a gavel. It's about how much of the world you can change without raising your voice. My uncle forgot that. He thought the crown was made of gold. He didn't realize it was made of responsibility. Dominic took his seat at the head of the table. It was the same chair Marcus had occupied, but on Dominic, it looked different. He didn't lounge. He sat with a disciplined, vertical grace that commanded the room's oxygen. He opened a ledger, not the one filled with Marcus's debts, but a new one, clean and white. The debt to the other families has been settled. The police have their scapegoat, and the streets have their order, he continued, looking at each man in the eye. From today, we stop chasing the flash. We return to the shadows. We rebuild the South Side. We protect our own. The Salazar name will once again mean that if you are under our wing, you are safe. And if you are in our way, you are already gone. A low murmur of "Yes, boss," rippled through the room. It wasn't the terrified subservience Marcus had demanded. It was the grounded respect of men who knew the storm had finally settled. Dominic looked back out at the skyline. The 20 years he had lost were a hollow ache in his chest that would likely never fully heal. But as he felt the heavy weight of his father's signet ring on his finger, he knew the sacrifice hadn't been in vain. He had been a prisoner, a ghost, and a shadow. But now, as the city began its morning bustle beneath him, he was something else entirely. He was the quiet storm, and under his command, the city would finally know the peace that comes only after the most violent of cleansings. The king was back, and for the first time in 2 decades, Chicago was exactly what it was meant to be, silent.